Wehrmacht veterans called them Die Nachtgeister, the night ghosts. After the war, captured German officers admitted something shocking. They would rather face an entire Allied division in daylight than endure a single night against British commandos. One Wehrmacht colonel, interviewed in 1946, stated, "We weren't afraid of dying. We were afraid of not knowing we were dying." Hakum, what made these elite British raiders so terrifying that hardened German soldiers preferred conventional warfare? The answer lies in a revolutionary approach to combat that shattered everything the Wehrmacht believed about war. 5,000 characters maximum, June 1940. The cliffs of Dover stood as Britain's last defensive line against Nazi Germany, which had conquered Europe in months with machine-like precision. Wehrmacht doctrine, perfected through blitzkrieg campaigns, relied on overwhelming force, coordinated armor, air superiority, and predictable hierarchical command. German military academies taught that war was a science. Identify the enemy, concentrate firepower, destroy systematically. Night operations were considered secondary, useful for repositioning, not primary assault. At Combined Operations Headquarters in Richmond Terrace, London, a different philosophy emerged from desperation. Britain couldn't match German industrial output. The Royal Air Force had barely survived the Battle of Britain. Traditional military doctrine meant slow death through attrition. Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark, a pragmatic officer who believed rules existed to be broken when survival demanded it, proposed something unprecedented. Small unit raids designed not for territorial gain, but for psychological devastation. The British Commandos were born from necessity in July 1940. Volunteers came from across the British Commonwealth, miners from Wales, fishermen from Scotland, farmers from Yorkshire, ordinary men trained to become extraordinary raiders. American military observers stationed in London under the Lend-Lease program watched with skepticism. Major William Donovan, who would later found the OSS, initially dismissed the concept. Pinprick raids won't win wars. But Colonel Lucian Truscott, observing commando training camps, saw something different. Warriors being taught to think independently, improvise constantly, and operate where enemies felt safest, in darkness. Wehrmacht occupation forces along the Atlantic Wall settled into routine by late 1940. German soldiers garrisoned French coastal towns, Norwegian fjords, Channel Islands. They established predictable patrol schedules, standard defensive positions, hierarchical communication protocols. Security relied on perimeter defense, searchlights, coordinated response. German doctrine assumed attackers would follow military convention, frontal assaults, identified objectives, withdrawal after engagement. The first Commando raid hit Guernsey on July 14, 1940. Wehrmacht soldiers reported chaos from nowhere, explosions without warning, sentries disappearing silently, communication wires cut simultaneously across positions, then complete withdrawal before reinforcements arrived. German after-action reports showed confusion. Enemy strength unknown, entry point unknown, objective unknown, method of withdrawal unknown. Oberst Heinrich Brandt, Wehrmacht intelligence officer stationed in Paris, read these reports with growing concern. His training taught that effective military operations left evidence, approach routes, force composition, tactical objectives. This raid left only questions. He wrote to High Command, "We are facing an enemy that deliberately violates accepted military practice. Our response protocols assume conventional behavior. These assumptions may prove dangerous." Wehrmacht leadership dismissed Brandt's concerns. Germany had conquered Poland in weeks, France in months. Britain was isolated, weakened, incapable of strategic offense. These raids were desperate propaganda stunts. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt issued standard orders, increased perimeter patrols, enhanced communication protocols, maintained defensive readiness. The Wehrmacht would respond to unconventional tactics with conventional discipline. But Brandt's unease deepened with each raid report. Vågsøy, Norway, German garrison attacked at dawn. Command post destroyed. Coastal defenses neutralized. Withdrawal complete before regional reinforcements arrived. Bruneval, France. Radar installation captured. Technical personnel kidnapped. Defensive positions bypassed entirely. Saint-Nazaire. Explosive-laden destroyer rammed into dry dock gates. Commandos fighting through town while dock facilities destroyed behind them. American observers documented these operations with professional interest. The US hadn't entered the war, but military analysts recognized revolutionary tactics. Captain James Roosevelt, eldest son of President Franklin Roosevelt and Marine Corps officer, trained with British commandos at Achnacarry in Scotland during 1941. He reported, "These men are taught to be comfortable in conditions where normal soldiers feel vulnerable. They own the night. They own uncertainty." The psychological impact emerged in Wehrmacht casualty reports. Soldiers stationed in quiet occupation zones requested transfer to Eastern Front combat units. Chaplains reported anxiety disorders, sentries unable to sleep, guards shooting at shadows, entire units maintaining exhausting alert levels during darkness. One Wehrmacht diary, captured after D-Day, described the experience. "I have fought Russians in winter. I have survived Stalingrad, but I cannot explain the fear of hearing nothing, seeing nothing, then discovering your comrade is gone, throat cut, dragged into darkness. They leave bodies as messages." By 1942, Wehrmacht forces along the Atlantic Wall faced an impossible problem. Conventional military strength meant nothing against enemies who attacked where defenses were assumed impenetrable, vanished before response arrived, and left psychological devastation, forcing entire garrisons into permanent high alert. The Wehrmacht's greatest strength, disciplined, hierarchical, predictable doctrine, had become its fatal vulnerability against adversaries who rewrote the rules completely. 5,000 characters maximum. Achnacarry Castle, Scottish Highlands, February 1942. Snow covered the training grounds where British commandos and American Rangers learned warfare, stripped of convention. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Vaughan, Commando training commandant, established one principle: comfort is the enemy, predictability is death. If you think like a soldier, you'll die like a soldier. Think like a ghost. American trainees arrived expecting advanced infantry tactics. They encountered something fundamentally different. The training didn't teach better ways to fight conventional battles. It taught abandoning convention entirely. Live ammunition exercises began immediately. Soldiers crawled under machine gun fire with bullets inches overhead. Instructors detonated explosives without warning. Men navigated highland terrain in complete darkness, carrying full combat loads. The philosophy was brutal. Simulate conditions worse than actual combat, so combat becomes manageable. Sergeant Thomas Sullivan from Boston, assigned to the 1st American Ranger Battalion, kept a training diary. January 15, 1942. Instructor threw live grenade into our barracks at 0200. Men who hesitated are gone from the program. January 22nd, 7-mile speed march, full kit, darkness, Norwegian fjord simulation. 3 men collapsed from hypothermia. Medics revived them. Instructors sent them back into the cold. January 29th, close quarters combat training with sharpened blades. First blood drawn means you're dead in real combat. I've been killed 11 times this week. The psychological conditioning was deliberate. Traditional military training emphasized unit cohesion through predictability. Same schedule, same drills, same responses. Commando training did the opposite. Constant unpredictability. Soldiers learned to function when exhausted, disoriented, isolated. They learned that plans meant nothing. Improvisation meant everything. Mock raids ended with trainers changing objectives mid-mission, cutting communications deliberately, forcing teams to adapt or fail. Physical conditioning exceeded conventional standards. Commandos completed 30-mile marches carrying 70-pound loads. They swam in frigid Scottish lochs, wearing full combat gear. They climbed cliffs with rope and blade. They learned silent killing, approaching sentries undetected, neutralizing without sound, disappearing before discovery. The training deliberately broke soldiers' assumption that darkness meant safety, routine meant security, numbers meant strength. American military observers debated the philosophy's value. General George Marshall, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, visited Akna-Kari in March 1942. He watched commandos rappel down cliffs in darkness, assault mock defensive positions using live explosives, withdraw through hostile terrain with casualties carried. Marshall told Colonel Vaughan, "This isn't training, this is transformation. You're not teaching tactics, you're changing how men think about warfare." The selection process reflected brutal realism. Volunteers faced immediate attrition. Physical fitness tests eliminated half immediately. Those unable to complete forced marches, obstacle courses, endurance swims. Psychological assessments eliminated another quarter. Men who needed structure, predictability, clear command hierarchy. The remaining candidates faced the Long March, 36 hours continuous movement through highland wilderness, carrying combat loads, completing timed objectives, zero sleep, minimal food, simulated enemy contact throughout. Failure rate exceeded 60%. Men returned to regular units ashamed, humiliated, but having learned critical truth. Elite operations required different mindsets, not just superior fitness. Lieutenant James Altieri, U.S. Army Ranger, described the realization. "I arrived thinking I was tough. I learned I was conventional. Tough means enduring hardship. Elite means thriving in chaos." The curriculum emphasized night operations because darkness neutralized Wehrmacht advantages. German forces possessed superior armor, artillery, air support during daylight. Darkness eliminated these asymmetries. Commandos learned to navigate by starlight, move silently across varied terrain, identify targets through sound and shadow, coordinate attacks without verbal communication. They trained with British equipment designed for stealth: rubber-soled boots, blackened weapons, suppressed firearms, silent entry tools. Close-quarters combat training was uniquely psychological. Instructors taught that killing wasn't about strength, it was about commitment without hesitation. Mock scenarios forced soldiers to make lethal decisions instantly: sentry or civilian, threat or neutral, engage or bypass. Hesitation meant failure. The training deliberately hardened men against natural reluctance, creating warriors capable of violence without moral paralysis. American Rangers adopted commando methodology completely. Colonel William Darby, commander of the 1st Ranger Battalion, told his men, "We're not infantry. Infantry fights for territory. We fight to terrorize. Our objective isn't holding ground, it's breaking minds." Darby understood that Wehrmacht doctrine couldn't adapt to enemies who abandoned territorial objectives entirely, attacked for psychological impact, measured success by enemy fear rather than ground captured. By mid-1942, Allied Special Operations Forces represented philosophical revolution in warfare. Traditional armies viewed night as defensive period, time for rest, resupply, repositioning. Commandos viewed night as offensive weapon, time when conventional forces felt secure, when darkness became tactical advantage rather than limitation. Wehrmacht intelligence analyzed raid patterns searching for predictability. They found none. Attack timings were random, target selection unpredictable, force compositions varied deliberately, withdrawal routes impossible to anticipate. The training created warriors psychologically prepared for conditions that broke conventional soldiers. They learned that exhaustion, fear, uncertainty, conditions normal troops avoided, represented their operational environment. They learned independence, every man capable of command, every team capable of adapting missions without central coordination. Most critically, they learned that psychological impact exceeded physical destruction. Destroying a single coastal battery meant little, making entire occupation force unable to sleep, constantly alert, perpetually fearful. That won wars. 5,000 characters maximum. Dieppe, France, August 19th, 1942, 0430 hours. Wehrmacht Oberst Georg Müller commanded coastal defenses protecting Dieppe harbour. His position was fortress-like. Concrete pillboxes, interlocking fields of fire, MG-42 machine guns covering every beach approach, artillery pre-registered on landing zones. Wehrmacht doctrine considered Dieppe impregnable against amphibious assault. Müller felt confident until darkness brought different war entirely. British commandos bypassed Dieppe's defences completely. Number 4 Commando, led by Lieutenant Colonel Lord Lovat, landed 6 miles east. Their objective wasn't frontal assault, it was Hesse Battery, massive coastal guns positioned on high ground behind Dieppe. Wehrmacht doctrine placed artillery safely rear, assuming enemies would be stopped at beaches. Commandos ignored beaches entirely. Müller first learned of the attack when communication lines went dead simultaneously. His headquarters radio crackled with fragmented reports. Battery Hesse under attack. Silence. Sentries not responding. Silence. Enemy in perimeter. Silence. Then explosions. 6 massive coastal guns destroyed within 12 minutes. Not damaged. Destroyed. Commandos placed demolition charges directly inside barrels, breach mechanisms, fire control systems. Wehrmacht engineers estimated weeks for repairs. Lovat's force withdrew before German reinforcements arrived, suffering minimal casualties. The psychological impact exceeded physical destruction. Müller's after-action report revealed doctrinal paralysis. Enemy approach through terrain maps, designated impassable. They bypassed defensive strongpoints, infiltrated rear positions, destroyed objectives before alert could be raised. Our response protocols require identified enemy position to coordinate counterattack. No position was identified. Our communications assumed hardwired security. Enemy cut every line simultaneously, suggesting reconnaissance we never detected. Our sentries were eliminated silently. Throat cut, garroted, indicating close quarters penetration, impossible per defensive doctrine. Wehrmacht High Command struggled to comprehend operations that deliberately violated military logic. Traditional warfare assumed rational objectives: capture territory, destroy formations, seize strategic assets. Commando raids achieved none. Attackers withdrew after destruction, held no ground, disappeared into darkness. German generals debated, were these reconnaissance, sabotage, or something unprecedented? General Major Erich Marx, Wehrmacht intelligence chief for France, commissioned psychological study of occupation troops. Results were alarming. 73% of soldiers reported chronic sleep deprivation, 56% showed elevated anxiety, 41% requested transfer to frontline combat units, despite higher casualty rates. Soldiers preferred predictable danger, artillery barrages, tank combat, infantry assault, over unpredictable nightmare of occupation duty, where any night could bring silent death. One captured Wehrmacht diary, dated November 1942, described the psychological decay. We are 500 soldiers holding this sector. We possess artillery, armor, air support. But every night, we are blind. Every shadow is threat. Every sound is approach. Yesterday, Heinz disappeared from guard post. We found him this morning, throat cut, dragged behind bunker. No one heard anything. British left his body positioned facing our barracks. They wanted us to find him. They wanted us to know they were inside our perimeter. I volunteered for Russian front. Command denied my request. They say occupation is safer. They don't understand. American military analysts documented the strategic impact. Colonel Lucian Truscott, now commanding U.S. Ranger battalions, reported to General Eisenhower. Wehrmacht is deploying 40% more troops to occupation zones than operational necessity requires. They're compensating for psychological erosion, not tactical threat. Every soldier watching shadows is one not fighting in Africa or Russia. The British are achieving strategic impact through psychological operations we never anticipated. The Wehrmacht attempted doctrinal adaptation. They increased perimeter patrols. Commandos learned patrol routes, avoided or ambushed them. They installed enhanced lighting. Raiders attacked during weather that nullified visibility. They implemented unpredictable inspection schedules. Commandos developed surveillance patience, waiting weeks for single vulnerability. Every German countermeasure assumed enemies would behave rationally. Commandos deliberately cultivated irrationality. Oberst Brandt, the Wehrmacht intelligence officer who warned about unconventional tactics in 1940, now commanded occupied Norway sector. He understood what High Command refused to accept. Doctrine had become liability. Wehrmacht training taught systematic response to identified threat. Commandos provided no identification. German soldiers were trained to maintain discipline under fire, coordinate with armor support, execute hierarchical commands. Commando tactics neutralized every advantage. Attacks came without engagement, armor was irrelevant, hierarchy was too slow for decision-making. Operation Archery, December 27, 1941, demonstrated complete psychological domination. British and Norwegian commandos, supported by American military observers, assaulted Vågsøy, Norway. Wehrmacht garrison possessed numerical superiority, fortified positions, rapid reinforcement capability. They lost 75% casualty rate within 2 hours. German survivors reported identical experience. Total confusion, inability to identify enemy positions, communication breakdown, leadership casualties from precision targeting, darkness making standard tactics impossible. The raid's true impact emerged in Wehrmacht reports afterward. German soldiers were discovered having abandoned defensive positions to hide in basements. Officers found drunk on duty, unable to cope with stress. Entire units requiring psychological evaluation before being considered combat-ready. One Wehrmacht psychiatrist wrote, "These men are not cowards. They are professionally trained soldiers who have been systematically conditioned to fear an enemy that violates every assumption their training provides." American Rangers absorbed these lessons, preparing for North Africa landings. Colonel Darby told his battalion before Operation Torch, "Wehrmacht expects us to fight like soldiers. We're going to fight like nightmares. They have doctrine, discipline, superior numbers. We have darkness, chaos, and the willingness to make them afraid to sleep." The philosophical revolution was complete. Traditional warfare measured success through territorial control, enemy casualties, strategic positioning. Commando warfare measured success through psychological erosion, operational paralysis from fear, forcing enemies to exhaust resources defending against unpredictable threat. Wehrmacht veterans preferred conventional combat because convention provided psychological safety, clear enemy, understandable tactics, predictable outcomes. Commandos removed every certainty, leaving only fear. 5,000 characters, maximum June 6, 1944, Zozro 16 hours. Pegasus Bridge, Normandy, France. British and American airborne forces launched history's largest amphibious invasion. But the first Allied soldiers in France arrived not with Dawn's invasion fleet. They arrived in darkness hours before, landing silently behind enemy lines. Wehrmacht defenders woke to discover bridges captured, communications destroyed, defensive positions neutralized. 3 years of commando operations had taught lesson now applied at strategic scale. Psychological dominance through night operations wins wars. Major General Matthew Ridgway, commanding U.S. 82nd Airborne Division, acknowledged doctrinal transformation. "We learned from British commandos that darkness isn't obstacle, it's weapon." Every American paratrooper trained in night operations, silent movement, independent decision-making represents philosophical debt to those early raiders who proved conventional doctrine was suicide against determined enemy. The statistical impact of commando operations from 1940 to 1944 validated revolutionary approach. Wehrmacht deployed over 150,000 additional troops to occupation zones, specifically for anti-raider defense, troops unavailable for Eastern Front or Mediterranean campaigns. German forces constructed thousands of additional fortifications inland from coast, diverting resources from blitzkrieg operations. Psychological casualties among occupation troops exceeded combat casualties in many sectors. One Wehrmacht medical report from 1943 estimated 37% of soldiers in low combat occupation zones exhibited stress disorders requiring treatment. More significantly, Commando tactics fundamentally altered Wehrmacht strategic planning. German high command could no longer assume rear area security. Every coastal position, supply depot, command headquarters, communication center required enhanced defensive allocation. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Atlantic Wall defenses in 1944, wrote, "We are defending against two enemies, the invasion we can see approaching and the raids we cannot predict. The second enemy has already won. They have paralyzed our ability to assume security anywhere." American Special Operations absorbed and expanded commando methodology. The Office of Strategic Services, OSS, founded by Major William Donovan, who initially dismissed pinprick raids, became America's first centralized intelligence and special operations agency. OSS operational groups trained at British facilities, learned commando tactics, applied them across European and Pacific theaters. Merrill's Marauders in Burma, Alamo Scouts in Philippines, OSS detachments in occupied Europe, all reflected doctrinal transformation initiated by desperate British innovation in 1940. The individual stories of commando veterans revealed human cost of psychological warfare. Lord Lovat survived the war, commanded the 1st Special Service Brigade, received Distinguished Service Order 3 times. But he spoke rarely of night operations, describing them as necessary evil that changed men permanently. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Vaughan, the Aknakari training commandant, suffered recurring nightmares decades after war's end, not from combat, but from transforming young men into warriors comfortable with darkness, silence, and killing. American Rangers who trained alongside British commandos carried lessons into post-war military doctrine. Colonel James Earl Rudder, who led Rangers at Pointe du Hoc during D-Day, later became president of Texas A&M University. He implemented leadership training emphasizing independent decision-making, comfort with uncertainty, adaptation over rigid planning, direct application of commando philosophy to civilian leadership development. The strategic legacy transformed modern warfare permanently. Every special operations unit globally, U.S. Navy SEALs, Army Special Forces, Delta Force, traces doctrinal lineage to 1940 British commandos who proved psychological operations achieve strategic impact exceeding conventional force. The realization that making enemies afraid to sleep was more valuable than destroying infrastructure revolutionized military theory. Declassified Wehrmacht documents from 1945 revealed the extent of psychological defeat. General Major Erich Marx, the intelligence officer who studied occupation troop psychology, wrote in Final War Diary, "We lost the Western Front not when Allies landed at Normandy. We lost when our soldiers became more afraid of night than day, when occupation became psychologically unbearable, when defending against unpredictable raids exhausted resources that should have reinforced frontline combat. The British proved that terrorizing rear areas creates strategic paralysis impossible to overcome with conventional military strength." Post-war interviews with Wehrmacht veterans consistently revealed the preference expressed in countless after-action reports. They would rather face entire divisions in daylight combat than endure a single night against commandos. Conventional warfare provided psychological safety through predictability. You knew when battle began, understood tactical objectives, recognized when engagement ended. Commando operations removed every certainty, no warning before attack, no clear objective, no defined conclusion. Just darkness, silence, then death for some while others waited their turn. The final assessment came from General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, in 1945, British commandos and American Rangers who learned from them achieved strategic impact impossible to measure through conventional metrics. They didn't capture territory, they captured minds. They didn't destroy armies, they destroyed certainty. They proved that making professional soldiers afraid represented force multiplication exceeding any weapon system. The Wehrmacht was militarily superior to Britain in 1940, but commandos were psychologically superior to Wehrmacht. That advantage won the war. The legacy endures in modern military philosophy. Darkness is weapon, unpredictability is tactic, psychological dominance is objective. Wehrmacht veterans preferred facing regular troops because regular combat followed rules. Rules they understood, rules their training prepared them to handle, rules that made war terrible but comprehensible. Commandos eliminated rules entirely. They made war incomprehensible, and incomprehension, they proved, was the most powerful weapon of all. If this story about the psychological warfare that broke the Wehrmacht opened your eyes to the untold aspects of World War II, hit that subscribe button and join our community uncovering history's most fascinating secrets. What other forgotten tactics changed the course of the war? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the stories that shaped our world. See you in the next video. And remember, history's greatest victories often came from those who dared to fight differently.